The big questions when we think about Brexit, there's been lots of debate, lots of conversation, lots of public discussion within the UK, within Europe, naturally. But when we think of Brexit, very often there's a series of claims about what Brexit could offer, why it's not working, why Brexit now is such a mess. And certainly with those who campaign for Brexit, there were a lot of hopes and I may say fantasies attached to Brexit. Hopes for regaining national sovereignty, to retake the nation, to believe in Britain, to become strong again and liberate yourself from the alleged Brussels or European oppression. But one question that we can talk a lot about, like how fantastical these ideas are, how realistic they are, how feasible they are. And in many ways, over the last 3 years, people in the UK and the UK government and the parliament have figured out that actually many of these proposals that were floating around and the hopes that were associated with Brexit are not that feasible, not that easy to translate, and economically most likely creating a self-inflicted wound. But putting all of that aside about the pros and cons of Brexit, one thing that hasn't been discussed enough, in my view, has been the question of democracy. And to some extent, both major parties in the British Parliament, the Tories as well as Labour, and much of the public debate within the UK and outside of the UK has focused on a notion that basically there was a democratic referendum, and this democratic referendum ultimately legitimizes only one option, and that is leaving the European Union. So any talk about a second referendum, about revisiting and potentially revising this decision has been seen as democratically illegitimate, because the one vote, the one close referendum in 2016 was taken as the kind of democratic decision where the people raised its voice and where the people made their decisions on the future of the UK and the future within the European Union, rather actually leaving the European Union. And my take on this is that this notion of democracy is essentially flawed. It has been taken as a common sense, it's taken for granted, but it actually is not what democracy is about. Democracy from a democratic theory point of view, and no matter how you look at this, if you're more the kind of deliberate democracy person who thinks that to some extent democracy, public participation in democratic elections or even democratic referenda are to some extent co-original and closely linked to rights entitlements, civil rights, and ultimately good and reasonable decisions. Or if you think actually there's a paradox in democracy, that actually democratic majorities can potentially make wrong decisions, can actually undermine the very democratic project. No matter what you think about that, ultimately democracy is more than just a single vote in a single moment as it was in 2016. Democracy is a complex ensemble of various aspects of decision making, of raising your voice, of engaging in public debate. And ultimately also it is about the capacity to revise decisions that might be flawed. And so the most democratic thing to do, this is what I would argue, is actually to have a second referendum. A second referendum that would be based on 3 years of public debate. Basically deliberative democracy at its work. 3 years of thorough debate of what are the real options about Brexit. What are the real possibilities and limitations of such a step? What does it really mean for society? And the complexities of that really just came out in the last 3 years. And we also had, by the way, a consistent majority of British voters actually in polls in the last 3 years in favor of remaining in the European Union. But even putting this aside, no matter what the decision would be, the most democratic thing from the point of view of democratic theory would be to have another referendum, to have another public engagement. Once you started the process of including referenda in the democratic process, once again, democracy entails more than just a single vote at a given moment in time, a certain moment of public articulation. It entails rights, it entails policy making, it entails questions of feasibility, it entails democratic representation. But the most democratic thing to do in light of the situation today, and in light of the fact that there was a very close decision 3 years ago, a lot of public engagement and debate over the next 3 years would be now to have a second referendum.